All right, I will jump into what I'm talking about today. I'm going to tell a story about one disastrous fire on a National Park Service site. So there's a lot of helpful overlap here. The peak is called Cerro Grande. So there's an image of it and then an image of the fire. And this was in 2000. And I'd like to talk about, I'll give you what's hopefully not too mind-numbing of detail of how the fire occurred and then its impact on national policy. But just to show you where we are you seeing, I just moved the next slide, but it's only showing up, I think, for Zoom. So maybe I have to stop sharing, but then Zoom, sorry.
Yeah, it's funny.
Because I'm saying what I want to see, but y'all aren't.
Technology. All right, everyone, hold up a second.
We could also try and make the sidebar big. I don't know how well people can read at the back with its size. But...
Let's see if this does it here.
Okay. Try hitting the next button and see where we go. Maybe we just have to leave it in the unpresenter mode like y'all did.
Yeah, let's see here.
That might be fine.
First time moderating, huh?
I'll just leave it this way and do it as you all did. I think that's as long as it's visible. Yeah,
that does it.
It worked for the previous one. So I'm sorry, I should have just started that from the beginning. But just to show you where this fire occurred, this is in northern New Mexico, very near Los Alamos, which plays a role in the story. Bandelier National Monument was actually founded because of its cultural resources. It has a really important history to the development of American archaeology. It's about a site of 33,000 acres, and today 22,000 is managed as wilderness. So it's got a complex ecosystem and something like 10,000 cultural sites that are still of important ceremonial use and active and used by pueblos. 2 Pueblo nations actually border the monument, and it is important for up to 24 tribal nations and pueblos in the area. In terms of the fire world, however, Bandelier, for a small park, it's not even a park, it's a national monument, actually played a pretty incredible role in terms of fire management, and particularly prescribed fire within the National Park Service. So as early as 1977, the superintendent had that idea, because of the centrality of cultural resources, to send archaeology techs ahead of the firefighters and the bulldozers to try and at least document or assess the impact of these fires on cultural resources. So integrating fire, cultural resources, and natural resources is something the monument did very well. It was one of the first NPS sites to host a prescribed fire module beginning in 1995, as well as Whiskey Town, Zion, and Yellowstone. And in addition, one key kind of source of this was the arrival of a scientist in the early 1980s who's still working in the Jemez Mountain Field Station in the area. And so he did his dissertation and research on the fire ecology of the mountains. So there's long data. He went and looked back prior, of course, to the arrival of colonization, but then also they've been collecting data on fire ecology ever since. And as early as the 1980s, the Resources Division incorporated fire management rather than it being a standalone aspect of how the monument's managed, that using fire as well as managing cultural resources and natural resources all occurred together. So this takes us up to the burn then. This particular portion of this is the footprint of the monument. And then these 2 areas that I've circled are the parcels that the managers have been trying to burn since the 1980s. They were incredibly fuel choked, so they knew that the stakes were high, and they tried to burn them in the 1980s several times, in the early 1990s. And then the fire that I'll talk about began being planned in 1999, but none of these earlier burns effectively actually reduced the fuel loads. And again, the whole point of this program at Bandelier was to use fire in a way that in a kind of ecological sense, not merely to reduce the threat of wildfire, but to return fire to the land to see what that ecosystem would have operated like prior to suppression. So their 2000 effort to burn was a much bigger parcel. It covered 1,000 acres. And these 3 phases will become important as I talk about what happened with the fire. They started up on the top, and then we're going to bring fire down the flanks. And then this phase 3 in the middle is a really densely coniferous forest. So just incredible. It's kind of the most fire choke of the whole parcel. So this was the plan for burning. As I mentioned, they had attempted in 1999 in the fall. Once again, the conditions were too wet to actually burn and use the fuel. So they moved to April. This is important, and it becomes a kind of, in terms of the public responses and visibility and critiques of the fire. They moved it to April. They found at this point they had enough data on sort of the fire ecology and history that often fires burned historically this time of the year. They were very attentive to the weather station very locally to where they were doing the burn. Later reports critiqued the Park Service for burning during drought. And they really honed in on the particular microclimate of where they were burning, which was not in drought. It also had received snow 3 days prior to the burn. So you're starting to get a sense of what some of the critiques are when this prescribed fire goes awry. So as they've done all of the work and double checked the weather forecast, they geared up to begin the prescribed fire on May 4th of 2000. They began by calling over 24 partners, tribal partners, Forest Service partners, the state department, state partners, basically to make sure that they had contingency resources available. They knew this was a high stakes burn. They notified the zone dispatch that evening, and then the burn boss was named Mike Powell, gave the fire briefing, and then began the burn. And this is one of the first, there's like all these dominoes, right? One of the first sort of domino is that prior to even burning, they noticed that their main crew were fatigued before they got to the top of the mountain. They didn't have a crew that was in adequate shape to actually carry out the burn. So by midnight, after they'd begun the prescribed burn, the burn boss sent that crew home, and he went down to get cell service, or actually like a landline. It's 2000. What are we talking about? Imagine those days. You had to leave the mountain and go and actually make a call to get more resources. He was told by the dispatcher that he could not fulfill his request and to call back in the morning. So we have another moment where he says, I know I need some more firefighters. The next morning, they'll ask for an airplane. And again, the dispatcher says you'll have to call back. So in the morning, the regional fire specialist for the National Park Service was named Paul Leeson. He was on site because of the kind of, just how the stakes of the fire, I suppose I'll say. And when they called again in the morning, the dispatcher asked, are you declaring this a wildfire? So what counts as a wildfire, what's a prescribed fire, and how resources are allocated is totally at the heart of this disaster. They said, no, we're still managing this as a prescribed fire. And amazingly enough, it took a few more hours until someone at this dispatch station, this is Forest Service, determined that they could send resources to the Cerro Grande burn by sending a crew that they were charging to a different burn. So they couldn't charge for additional resources, or they believed they couldn't charge for additional resources to go into a prescribed fire. So that's the first, that brings us up to 10 a.m. then, the morning after they began the burn. By this point, they have a hotshot crew in addition to another crew on the fire, but it escaped on the east flank. I'll have a map later on, but to the east is where Los Alamos is. Los Alamos, famous for building the atomic bomb, also a site of a tremendous amount of toxic waste today, and some of the leading, kind of most scientifically advanced nuclear and other defense weapons. 4 miles from the burn. That morning, there's another kind of domino when the helicopter did arrive. So that morning they said, I need a type 1, I need a crew that is a type 2 crew, and I also need a helicopter with water. The helicopter arrives, the crew arrives, the helicopter doesn't have water. So the helicopter goes to get the water that was requested. He starts at a local ranch, brings like a drop or two, then someone tells him you can't do that, we don't have permission. So he has to go to the Rio Grande reservoir, it's the Cochiti Reservoir, it's maybe 18 to 20 miles, to get the water that was requested. Initially would have been requested at the night prior. So finally at midday, as there's a slop over, it's escaped the original bounds of the fire. The Charissa Doriak is the research manager, who herself actually got her start at Yosemite and was very a big proponent of prescribed burning. They decided they had to, in fact, classify the fire as a wildfire in order to get more resources, which then, of course, changes the way that the fire is fought. So Gleason is now overseeing this, and this is another key moment here. He had 2 options in terms of treating, such as now suppressing the fire, continuing to manage it. And he was concerned because if he brought the fire down the flanks along the road, which is what he ended up deciding to do, his concern was that he'd be critiqued for continuing to fight as if it were a prescribed burn, using a strategy that he's not supposed to use now that it's a wildfire. He had quite a lot of experience by this point and was in a very similar situation. The other option would have been to bring the fire right through that densely loaded valley in the middle, right? And he was very concerned. His own firefighters had been gravely injured in a previous fire. So he made the choice for his crew's safety. He knew very well it would be a kind of contentious choice. And I'll say, this history is like bonkers because no one agrees, and everyone's still very traumatized by the whole thing. So it's really hard to even get the story straight. So I can't say this or publish this, but a research manager still at Bandelier today told me in March when I gave this presentation to their team, she is entirely certain that by bringing the fire down the flank, it brought it into the area where the wind whips around, which is eventually what picked up the fire and took it into Los Alamos. I don't actually have sources where I can like acknowledge that as a source, but I think that makes a lot of sense. So they continued to fight the fire this way for like another day. Where are we? Here we go. I mentioned his strategy. But on Sunday, and recall when the weather forecast at the time when they went to burn on the 4th did not indicate high wind. By Sunday, high winds kick up, gusting up to 50 miles an hour. So at that point, they declared that this needed to be run under a level 1 incident command structure, which basically brings in additional resources in an important way, but removes Bandelier and the National Park Service from any decision-making authority. So they handed over, and then it's within the next 2 days that fire tears through Los Alamos, including the laboratory. The National Park Service responded by putting the superintendent and all of the involved parties on administrative leave. The other thing that's going on here is I'll show you this photo. This is one photo from the town of Los Alamos as folks were evacuating. And I'll give you the stats, but hundreds of homes were lost. This is 2000, it's an election year. Secretary of Interior at the time is Bruce Babbitt. He felt a need to rush in to conduct an investigation and be able to tell the public what happened. So by May 18th, the fire's still smoldering. The worst of it's done by the 12th or 13th. It's still burning. And he already has completed a report and it's very clear. The report lays clear blame on the individuals at Bandelier and on the conditions under which they chose to burn, which in hindsight look very different than the information that was available when the plan was, of course, made. All of the fire crew, or not even crew, scientists, archeologists, the folks who are working in the fire management office at Bandelier had all of their computers confiscated by the Department of Interior. And at the end, when it was fully contained on July 6th, the fire had burned 48,000 acres. It was the largest in New Mexico's history, and 235 structures, which was more like 400 and some homes, because many were duplexes. So a lot of people lost their homes, including one of the NPS staff that I interviewed and worked with. Shortly thereafter, the NPS director said, we need to get this right, and brought together an independent review board, which included folks from the Park Service and the Forest Service and other agencies to actually properly conduct an investigation. Unfortunately, that's not done until February of 2001, at which point the narrative is pretty clear in the public's mind of what happened here. Okay, so what happened? So it's quite complicated, but I think I've kind of pointed at a few of them, as I hope, as I've told you the story. Part of this is the contingency resources. Why and who, how do we understand? How does the Forest Service understand? How does the Park Service understand what resources are available, whether it's a prescribed burn or whether it is a fire suppression approach? Some of this is the 1990 federal fire policy, which Bandelier's resource manager, who was just very sharp and expert and has a lot of expertise in fire, continues to point to as a policy which indicates that agencies need to be sharing resources across the board, right? It's the interagency kind of fire structure that we take for granted today. The NPS had not completely implemented it, and there's also weird bad blood between the particular Forest Service region and this particular National Park Service park. So there's sort of unwritten aspects of the relationships that are operating here. This is also bonkers. The actual, like, this tiny error was that the National Park Service had the incorrect worksheet on its website. So it's a very small thing, but essentially, as Bandelier or National Park Service folks were developing a fire plan, if they had the updated worksheet, they would have rated its complexity slightly greater, and from the beginning would have had more crews on the ground. Who knows what that would have done, but it certainly would have changed things. All right, I'm getting towards the end here. So in terms of sort of zooming out and having a sense of the impact more broadly, this totally decimated Bandelier and then prescribed burning throughout the National Park Service because of the public perception. It's very, very bad when a federal agency starts a fire, becomes a wildfire that takes out people's homes and threatens like the livelihood or livability of an entire region, given all of the dangerous waste at Los Alamos. The 2000, immediately afterwards, the 2000 fire management policy greatly expanded resources for burning, and the focus shifted. So it really shifted on focusing on this WUI, which we've already heard about, right? Really protecting homes, mechanical thinning, which we've heard about, but not prescribed fire in the approach that Bandelier was really championing, which would have meant returning to a fire ecosystem, getting fire back on the land as it might naturally occur from a broader landscape perspective on what that does to the ecosystem. Interestingly enough, the massive legislation that was passed to address the victims who lost their homes, as well as tribes. Tribes were impacted by this in some complicated ways as well, I can say more about, but it actually became the blueprint for the 9/11 legislation. So this was the largest wildfire in New Mexico history until 2013, when the next largest wildfire also decimated Bandelier as well as Santa Clara Pueblo. And the Pueblo still feels pretty strongly that decisions were made to sacrifice their land at the cost of Los Alamos. I just got another earful about that in March, giving this presentation. In addition, and I've tried to write that in, but sources are complicated. In addition then to what was happening at Bandelier, the next largest wildfire occurred just 3 years ago in New Mexico's history, which was the 2022 Cass Canyon Hermit's Peak fire. Some uncanny parallels here. It was burned or begun in April as a prescribed burn by the Forest Service this time, and it escaped into a massive wildfire. It's in a very remote part of northern New Mexico where Hispano villagers and families have been for 300 or 400 years. Fascinating culturally, the way that they still live in many ways off subsistence and have maintained a very unique dialect of Spanish, and did not have the same kinds of insured homes that many people would imagine. So something like 400 families lost their homes in that fire. I'll stop there for the sake of time, but here's my email if anyone has questions, and thanks so much.